know, the rock looks really slick, but it might be grippy. I don't know if I can make it back up that. I don't know if I can make it back up this.
40,000 years.
We've always felt that Vanguard Cave, which had been sealed long before any of us went down to the cave, about 40,000 years ago.
That is how long this room had been sealed. No light had entered it. No sound had moved through it. No living thing had breathed the air inside it. For 40,000 years longer than every empire, every city, every written word in human history, it simply waited.
Just in the entrance now, it's going to get so much bigger.
That's amazing. Absolutely wonderful.
This is definitely a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I'm so excited about being here.
And when a team of archaeologists pressed their tools into the wall of sand blocking the passage and felt it give, every person in that cave understood immediately that something had just changed. Not something small. What they found on the other side did not just rewrite history, it rewrote us. The Rock and the Hidden Archive. The Rock of Gibraltar sits at the very edge of Europe, where the continent narrows to a point, and the Mediterranean opens in front of you like a door left ajar. For 3,000 years, empires fought to control its surface. Romans, Moors, British naval commanders, they all understood that whoever held this rock controlled the passage between worlds. But the story that matters most was never on the surface. It was inside the rock, in the dark, in the silence, in chambers that nobody knew existed until someone started digging. Carved into the southeastern cliff face, barely visible from the water below, is a network of 4 interconnected limestone caves. 120,000 years of continuous human occupation, layered inside the rock like the pages of a book that nobody thought to open. 120,000 years. Every city in the ancient world, every war ever recorded, every piece of art that ever survived to a museum, all of it fits inside less than 10% of that timeline. The Gorham's Cave Complex is the rest of it, the part we never read. The Sealed Chamber. Professor Clive Finlayson, director of the Gibraltar National Museum and one of the world's leading experts on Neanderthal behavior, had been excavating Vanguard Cave, one of the 4, for 9 years. 9 years of sediment, layer by layer, centimeter by centimeter, century by century. You do not find things quickly in this work. You earn them. Each centimeter of removed sediment is hundreds of years of compressed human activity. Fire ash, food debris, broken tools, things dropped and left behind by people who never expected anyone to come looking. You move backwards through time at the speed of careful hands with small brushes. 9 years of that. 9 years before his team hit something that stopped them. Not rock, not debris, sand. Ancient, compacted, dense, and completely wrong for where it was sitting. A coastal dune had swept across the cave entrance at some precise historical moment and sealed the chamber behind it like a vault door swinging shut. Not gradually, all at once. A geological accident so specific, so perfectly timed, that it preserved everything on the other side with almost impossible completeness. That seal was 40,000 years old, intact, untouched. Nobody had entered. Nothing had disturbed it. Whatever was inside had been sitting there, in perfect stillness, since the same era the last known Neanderthals walked this exact coastline. Consider what that actually means for a moment. The pyramids at Giza are roughly 4,500 years old. This seal was 9 times older than that. The entire span of recorded human civilization, every empire, every dynasty, every war, every invention from the wheel to the printing press to the satellite, fits inside less than 10% of the time this chamber had been sitting undisturbed. And yet the contents were intact. The evidence was preserved. Nothing had been lost. Finlayson described it publicly as a once-in-a-lifetime discovery. He was being modest, because the sand had not been protecting the emptiness. It had been protecting evidence. The kind of evidence that makes you sit down on the cave floor and stare at what you are holding and understand that the story you thought you knew, the story every museum and every textbook and every documentary had agreed on for 100 years, was wrong. The predator bones. The first things they found were bones. Not human bones, animal bones, but the wrong animals entirely. Lynx, spotted hyena, griffon vulture. three apex predators from completely different ecological niches. No biological reason to share a space, no flood, no landslide, no natural event that would concentrate them here, like this, together sealed inside an elevated interior chamber at the back of a coastal cliff. You cannot explain this with geology. You cannot explain it with animal behavior. The only explanation that survives is the one that changes everything. Someone put them there. Someone made deliberate choices about what entered that chamber and what did not. Someone curated this space. Other research from Finlayson's team had already found something strange. Neanderthals at Gibraltar were hunting eagles, falcons, and corvids systematically, repeatedly not for food, but for their feathers. Wing feathers. Flight feathers. The kind with no caloric value at all. The kind used for one thing: ornamentation, decoration, making yourself look a certain way to others who are watching. The predator bones in the sealed chamber fit that picture exactly. A population that related to these animals as symbols, as materials, as objects of meaning, not just as prey. And then the team noticed the walls, deep claw marks, raked directly into the limestone surface, parallel gouges made by something large, something that had been enclosed in that space and spent its final time tearing at the walls in total darkness. Nobody can say with certainty what made them. Nobody can say when. Nobody can say what this chamber was for, or what ritual or logic organized the bones or brought the animals here, or made someone decide that this specific sealed interior space was the right place for whatever was happening inside it. But the bones did not gather themselves. The marks did not make themselves. None of this was accidental. And sitting among it all at the very deepest point of the chamber, the farthest possible corner from the entrance, was one more object. Small, quiet, completely out of place. The sea snail. A whelk, a large edible sea snail, sitting alone at the back of a sealed cave, roughly 20 meters from the nearest beach. Whelks do not travel inland. They do not climb cliff faces or navigate narrow cave passages or find their way to the deepest interior corner of an elevated sealed chamber on their own. The only possible explanation is that a Neanderthal carried it there deliberately, specifically, purposefully up from the beach below, through the cave entrance, down the passage, to this exact spot. That is not foraging. That is a destination. A plan that existed completely in someone's mind before the first step was taken toward the water. Think about what that actually requires. To carry something from the coast to a specific interior location at a specific elevation, a specific distance from the entrance, in a specific corner, you first have to form the idea of doing it. You have to identify a future need. You have to evaluate a solution to that future need before the need has arrived. And then you have to execute a physical journey whose entire justification exists only in your imagination. Scientists call that future-oriented cognition, the ability to act now for reasons that only exist later, somewhere else, under circumstances that have not happened yet. For most of the 20th century, mainstream paleoanthropology argued that Neanderthals did not have it, could not have it. That this kind of mental projection, this ability to see yourself in a future moment and work backwards into the present, was a uniquely modern human trait, one of the things that separated us from them, one of the reasons they disappeared, and we did not. The whelk sitting alone in the dark for 40,000 years does not argue with that theory. It just waits, patiently, and the waiting is the answer. But a sea snail proves food storage. What the team found buried in the deeper layers of the cave proves something that changes the definition of what a Neanderthal actually was, something that would have been called impossible by the science of 50 years ago and is still difficult to fully absorb now. The glue factory. Published in 2024, researchers announced the discovery of a hearth structure in the deeper sediment layers of Vanguard Cave. A structure unlike anything in the entire archaeological record of Neanderthal sites. Not a fire pit dug for warmth, not a ring of stones for cooking, something entirely different, circular in form. 2 deliberate channels were carved into the floor, constructed walls designed specifically to regulate the internal atmosphere. Every element of this structure existed to serve a precise function in a precise process. a process that the architecture itself encoded, like instructions written in stone. They were making tar. Specifically, they were burning gum rock rose, a resinous shrub that grows throughout the Mediterranean coastal scrubland around Gibraltar, inside this hearth, in a carefully controlled low-oxygen environment. That controlled atmosphere forces the adhesive compounds out of the plant tissue without burning them away. What comes out the other side is tar, dense, sticky, and extraordinarily useful for one specific purpose: binding stone tool heads to wooden shafts, building composite hunting spears, weapons where separately manufactured components are joined together into something more powerful and more precise than either part alone. This is not primitive. This is industrial chemistry applied to a recurring manufacturing problem, and the product is a weapon that requires the builder to hold the entire finished object in their mind before a single piece has been shaped. But the heart is not just evidence of the product, it is evidence of the process, and the process is what should stop you. This process cannot be discovered by accident. You cannot stumble into pyrolysis. You have to identify the right plant from among dozens of options growing in the same landscape. Then you have to understand that it's a useful compound. The resin is locked inside it and cannot be released with ordinary open flame. Then you have to design and build a physical apparatus specifically engineered to create the correct atmospheric conditions for extraction. Then you have to execute the heating with enough precision to produce usable tar without destroying it with too much oxygen, and the resin burns away entirely, too little heat, and nothing separates at all. The working window is narrow, and then you have to apply the result correctly to manufacture a weapon that actually functions. Every single one of those steps requires knowledge. Knowledge that cannot be intuited. Knowledge that can only be acquired through trial and failure and refinement over time, and then transmitted deliberately from one person to the next. That is teaching. That is learning. That is a tradition of technical knowledge moving through generations inside a cave on a cliff above the Mediterranean Sea. Small, informal, unwritten, but real. 60,000 years ago. The hearth does not just prove that Neanderthals could make tools. It proves they had something to teach, and someone willing to learn it, and a way to pass it on. That is not survival. That is culture. And they were not done. The engraving. And then there is the wall, a geometric crosshatch pattern, carved directly into the bedrock of Gorham's Cave, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, more than 39,000 years old, at a time and in a location where modern humans had not yet arrived anywhere near this part of Europe. Researchers replicated the process with identical stone tools on an identical rock surface, and their conclusion was unambiguous. Producing this pattern required running a pointed tool through the same groove a minimum of 54 separate times, in sequence, with sustained focus, each stroke reinforcing and deepening the one before it. 54 strokes. Not one mark made in passing, not a scratch from a tool being sharpened. 54 deliberate, sequential, intentional actions, each one placed in service of a pattern that existed in someone's mind before the first stroke was made. This is not a scratch. This is not an accident. This is not an animal marking territory. This is someone who had an image in their mind and decided to put it on the wall. For the entire modern era of paleoanthropology, that was the line. Symbolic thought, the ability to form an abstract concept and translate it into a physical mark, was considered the definitive cognitive boundary between us and every other species that came before us. Not tool use, not fire, not cooperation. This. The mark was made for no practical reason except that the mind that made it needed to make it. It was the thing that made our survival feel inevitable, the thing that made their extinction feel logical, the thing that separated the story of humanity from the story of every species that did not make it. The crosshatch in Gorham's Cave does not ask permission to exist on the wrong side of that line. It just sits there. 39,000 years of patience, 54 strokes of someone's hand, pressed into stone for reasons we still cannot fully explain, waiting for the day someone would come with a torch and look closely enough to understand what they were seeing. Professor Finlayson has stated publicly, the design is clearly abstract, clearly intentional, and at the time of its creation, there were no modern humans anywhere near Gibraltar. The Neanderthals were not imitating us. They were not learning from us. They were not inspired by contact with a more cognitively advanced species passing through the region. They arrived at symbolic thought on their own because whatever capacity produces that impulse, it was already inside them. It did not come from us. It was not borrowed. It was theirs. And that means the story we told ourselves about the unique, exceptional, irreplaceable human mind, as the engine of our survival, is not the story of a species. It is the story of a survivor who convinced themselves their victory was inevitable. Climax. Now hold all of it together. A Neanderthal population on the southern tip of Europe, harvesting the full resources of the Mediterranean fish, mussels, monk seals, and dolphins. Hunting birds of prey not for food, but for meaning, for decoration, for the way their feathers looked against skin. Engineering chemical manufacturing hearths using plant chemistry they had spent generations learning to master, teaching that knowledge to their children who taught it to theirs. Carrying food into sealed elevated spaces against future need, and pressing abstract geometric designs into cave bedrock with the focused, deliberate, unhurried attention of a mind that had decided this mark mattered. That is not a species struggling to hold on. That is a culture. A sophisticated, technically capable, symbolically aware culture living on a cliff above the Mediterranean, while the rest of their kind was disappearing from the rest of the world. And they watched their world disappear. Not in a day. Over centuries and millennia, slowly, incrementally, the way things end when no single moment feels like the end. During the Ice Age, the Neanderthals of Gorham's Cave looked out from this cliff across 4.5 kilometers of open land that stretched into what is now the sea, their coastal shelf, their hunting ground, the beach where they collected shellfish, the shallows where they waded for fish, the rocky outcroppings where seals rested in the sun. All of it was their territory. All of it was the material foundation of everything they had built. It is all underwater now. 4.5 kilometers of their world, erased from above the surface of the earth as completely as the people who once lived on it. The sediment record suggests they held on far longer than the official extinction timeline admits, possibly until 33,000 years ago, maybe 24,000. Separated from the encroaching modern world by nothing more than 14 kilometers of open water at the Strait of Gibraltar. Africa visible on a clear day from the cave entrance. Europe is disappearing behind them. What happened in those final years, whether there was contact across the water, whether knowledge moved in either direction, whether the last of them were aware of what was coming or simply went on living until they could not, we do not know. The sediment record goes quiet before it answers that question. That silence might be the most honest thing it could say. We have spent a century studying Neanderthals, naming them, classifying them, filling entire libraries with analysis of their anatomy and their tools and their decline, building exhibits to display their bones beneath glass, teaching their extinction as a settled fact explained cleanly by our own cognitive superiority, as if the story of their disappearance was simply a matter of the better-equipped species winning and the lesser one stepping aside, as if that outcome was always the only possible outcome. We needed them to be inferior. That is the uncomfortable truth underneath all of the science. If they were inferior, then what happened to them makes sense. If they were inferior, then our survival would feel earned rather than fortunate. If they were inferior, then we do not have to sit with the darker question of what it actually means that they are gone. The sealed chamber was sitting in the dark the entire time, not arguing, not protesting, just holding its evidence with a patience that embarrasses everything we thought we were certain about. They harvested the ocean. They taught their children chemistry. They carried food into darkness for a future that existed only in their minds. They decorated themselves with the feathers of birds they hunted with weapons they built by mastering industrial processes that took generations to refine. And they pressed a geometric idea into the bedrock of a limestone cave. 54 deliberate strokes for a reason that made complete sense to the mind that made it, even if we cannot fully recover that reason now. They were not primitive. They were not dim. They were not the convenient intellectual inferior that a century of science needed them to be. They were a people, with knowledge and culture, and the capacity to mark their world with meaning, with teachers and learners and traditions moving across generations, with a sense of the future, a sense of the self, and a sense demonstrated in stone that what the mind contains is worth making visible. And whatever finally ended them, whatever closed the distance between their last days in this cave and the silence that followed it, was not a failure of the mind. It was not inferiority. It was not the inevitable victory of a more capable species sweeping through and erasing the lesser one, because that is simply how evolution works. The cave does not tell us what it was. It only preserves what they left behind. The cave does not care what we believe, it only preserves what was true.